I'm Jacqueline Terrebonne. I'm the editor-in-chief of Gallery Magazine. And I wanted to introduce our wonderful panelists. I'm thrilled to have Amelia Handegan here on our panel. She is a fellow Southerner like me, which is wonderful because Southerners are excellent storytellers, and I feel...
No pressure.
No pressure. She's just a wonderful storyteller. No, but I feel that if you've seen her projects up on the screen here, each room and each home really tells a story, and has a great eye and way with expressing the history of the homes that she works with, especially in Charleston where she lives. And we have Annabelle Selldorf, esteemed architect. If you've been to a museum or a gallery, you've experienced the wonder of her work and how she can transform an old space like the Neue Gallery into something fresh and new, or the Rebel Museum, which just opened in Miami. They're both fantastic spaces, as well as lots of galleries, and she can even make a sanitation recycling facility a work of art in Sunset Park. And on a personal note, we go to the same Pilates studio, and she is excellent at that as well. And Brian, that's quite impressive. And Brian McCarthy, who is such a talented designer. I think he has such an elegance and glamour in his work that also has an element of restraint while being just absolutely luminous, as his book Luminous Interiors is called. And he's been on the cover of Gallery Magazine as well.
The one and only.
His one and only cover, which was an exquisite project. So I welcome all of you here today. For questions and panels, I like to start off with sort of the big idea. So I'd like each panelist to tell us, how you like to incorporate the old and the new in your interiors and your architecture, and what sort of your philosophy about that is. So Brian, if you want to...
Well, it starts with a client, and in addition to the client, it's whether the physical space is existing, whether it's new architecture, what's the vocabulary of the architecture, what's the client's interest, what's their lifestyle, is it a family? There's so many kind of probing questions that I begin with, when we start. I also love to encourage clients to put together image books, and we will likewise add imagery, in our meetings so that we can start to create a dialogue that everybody responds to. So I'd say the process is essentially the same with every client, but the road that you get on is entirely different. We do so many very different projects, stylistically, which is what makes it so exciting for me as a decorator. And I'm also an architecture junkie, and I love the design process and the building process.
That's great. And Annabelle, what about for you? What's your philosophy for mixing old and new?
I'm void of philosophy. No, I think that it's not so much about old or new, about antique or vintage. I think it is rather about the circumstance, much like what Brian said. I think so much of it has to do with who is your client, what is their circumstance, what are the spaces surrounding them, and then you find your way. Maybe more than anything, it's about enduring quality, and it's about appropriate context. Sometimes that means confrontation, sometimes it's a sort of unique juxtaposition. In all cases, it's about authenticity.
And Amelia?
Well, I approach every project a little differently, but I think my main goal in your question is that things are compatible because of scale, color, material. There has to be some connection to juxtapose different elements in a room. And I think it comes through an intuitive eye, and I think your client is dictating some of that rather than what pieces they want to use. And in the end, it's all coming together, but I think it's layering and seeing how these pieces work against each other, contemporary with traditional.
I was going to say too, I think, you have clients that are collectors and you have clients that are really interested in creating a home and decorating a space, so that's also a different component. And so how you begin with a project, are you beginning with things that need to be placed, that need to be considered? Is it art? Is it furniture? What is it? I mean, that's a big part of the evolution in the beginning of any of the projects that we do.
So does a specific project jump into mind where everything just sort of came together in just the right way and hit all the notes, and they had the right pieces and let you work with them to find the right things?
Well, they didn't quite have all the right pieces.
Okay.
They existed in the beginning because there were several pieces that they'd gotten around the time that they got married. So this was a project down in California. So we did the project, and they then went off to London for 3.5 years. And when they got back, and I was sort of prepping them for the 3.5 years that they were away, that when they got back, we were going to make some changes. But back to the question, though, what was wonderful is they're big modern art collectors, and so they had the beginning of a great collection, and so being able to think about where certain pieces might begin really led to how we were going to work with color, how we were going to work with pattern. So it was a fascinating, and it's also a client that really made the distinction that art is not a science, decoration is not a science, it's an art. And this was now almost 20 years ago, that was a major shift for me to hear a client present themselves that way, because it meant they understand the process and that you don't always get it right and that it does have to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Annabelle, do you have a project that comes to mind where the old and new just...
Well, as an architect, I probably approach things a little bit differently, and I think that for me, a sort of successive layering of how you experience a house or an apartment or a space is initially informed by the proportions of the space and the circulation around them and how they are put to use. And I like fewer things rather than more things, and so I try to understand a person rather than just their things. And there's a house which we showed here, a house in Cologne, where my client, who is somewhat younger than I am, came up to me and I said, I didn't know her, and she said, I would so much love to work with you because I know you're going to make this old, dusty house a new house. And in the course of time, we developed this very close relationship, and we sort of discovered each other's likings and not likings, and ended up finishing each other's sentences. And everything did come together. They did buy amazing things, and it was completely reciprocal, which I think at the end of the day is what makes it fun and makes it fun and personal.
Right.
And that's what you get out of it. And I always go there I always stay there when I go there. And I think the sort of longevity of the relationship plays a big part in how we work.
It's marriages.
Right.
I mean, I always refer meeting a potential client as a first date. And when you finish that first date, do you want to have that second date? So it's so much about this relationship building.
So when the comfort level and the vocabulary and dialogue falls into place.
Yeah.
And have you had an experience like that, Amelia, where it's just sort of...
I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to use my own houses that I've moved from a Greek revival to a neoclassical apartment in Charleston. And so I had to go through and scale down after 25 years of the Greek revival what I was going to bring to a client to the new space. And I wanted it more contemporary. And I walked into the building, it had beautiful 13-foot ceilings and beautiful metal windows, and built in 1923, I think, 26. And I took out all the molding and I began putting in the things I love the most, which were antique portraits. I collect faces, basically, and some 18th century porcelain. And then I started adding in all the things I collected while traveling. And I left a lot behind, but I was able to, it still feels like my house, but I was able to upgrade to a more clean sensibility, I guess, of moving into, I had the advantage of the new space. And I think working with clients is a little bit the same. You all of a sudden have set things and then you slowly weed it out because nobody wants to part with everything in a minute. You've got to talk them into it and replace.
And did you move the pieces around? Were they in different rooms than they lived in the original house?
Yeah, they're in different rooms, space, yeah, a lot of it. And I bought a few new things to replace some things that I was tired of. And it feels like a fresh new place, but I have main things that I loved I took with me. And I think that's for clients too. You take with you what you love the most.
So speaking of things that you love, what have you loved at this year's show? What have you seen?
I've loved a lot. I love the Chinese portraits and that beautiful light fixture and that chandelier in that same space. I think it's an 1840s fixture. They look beautiful together. I love the bark cloth painting by, I think his name is Italy, I'm not sure. But it was beautiful. And then the Belgian clay mask. I like such a variety of things I walk through. And truthfully, I walk down the aisle. By the time it's over, I'm a little dizzy because my head's moving back and forth so fast.
I think we all are, yeah. And Annabelle, what have you seen?
Open your bag.
Yeah.
I'll get to that. I think it is an incredibly nice thing that the first thing you see is the Hispanic Society booth. And it sort of is an interesting contrast because it's a museum collection. Where do you have a little El Greco hanging over to the left and all these incredibly interesting things that we know little about. Now, I can be accused of bias here because we're working with the Hispanic Society. But it's this, Hispanic Society is this incredible place on Almond Terrace at 155th Street and Broadway. And it's currently closed to the public, but you can go and see the Soraya collect room by appointment. The art of Hispanic and Latin American art is simply phenomenal. So I think you should dedicate time to looking at these things. And having said that, of course, everybody else has to up the ante and bring incredible things themselves. But as Brian said, if you look in my handbag, you'll find a gold cup that is at Thomas Hennige's booth. No, it's in my bag.
Right.
Anyway, that's by far my favorite piece.
Okay.
Mostly because it's so transportable.
Something to look for in a piece. All right. And what about you, Brian? I feel like whenever I see you at a fair or show, I try to follow behind you and see what you're spending time looking at because it's usually something pretty great.
There are a number of things, but what I want to say first, though, is just listening to Annabelle, I want to see through your eyes. Because it's so fascinating to me with all the museum work that you do, because you walk through space and you see all of these objects and art and furniture in a very different way than I know I do. Mm-hmm. So I'd be fascinated to tag along with you one time. And
we should do that.
Yeah.
What I love about this show is the variety, particularly now. I mean, it's so coming into the 21st century, and so there were a number of things that I've pinpointed. One is the Paul Evans cabinet that Global Modern has. Ayala Sarfati at Maison Girard, who's known for her sort of cloud-like lights that are made out of glass sort of tubing and this sheathing, but she's done a suspension that is with some composite, but it's absolutely beautiful, and it's a huge break, I think, for her sort of moving forward. There's a beautiful pair of William Kent chairs at the back, an English dealer, that are extraordinary. I think they were made for Houghton Hall or one of the great houses. And opposite that is a dealer who has this great trompe-l'oeil panel at the back that looks like an empty bookcase. And I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, there's that mosaic cabinet at Blairman that is totally beautiful.
Yes.
And in fact, that kind of tradition of English arts and crafts is really interesting because it shows how much it informs modernist furniture and placement of furniture. So they have absolutely gorgeous things. So we shouldn't tell you that because then we can get those things.
So what about the getting of things at a fair? What's your tactic? If you're really shopping a fair, are you mapping out where you want to go before? Are you following the aisles? What's sort of your strategy?
Well, for me, opening night, like last night, is a bit of a nightmare because you spend more time talking than you do actually looking. But I always have a list in the back of my mind of, for particular clients, knowing the fair that I'm going to be on the lookout for things. I generally don't. Sometimes I'll come to an opening with clients, but it's easier if I'm able to sort of pre-shop. So I'll come with somebody from the office and we'll really have a plan of what we need to be sort of tackling. And so I approach it that way. But here you see a million things that have nothing to do with what you're looking for, that you're desperate to find a home for.
And how about you, Annabelle? Did you have your eye on the Gold Cup last night or beforehand?
I will admit that I didn't know about it. It wasn't exactly something that I was looking to purchase, if you understood what the price point is, but it was an object that I knew I would be very interested in. I don't so much go shopping because I don't work right in the same manner as both of you do. So I have the luxury of wandering and going like, oh my God, I saw this thing that is so beautiful. Who can I pawn it off on? And sometimes it strikes me as like, oh, this would be great in so-and-so's house, or I'm working on a project and I thought it's like, maybe we could move this around and it would be great there. So it's much less, I have less knowledge and less system than probably either one of you do. But the pleasure of finding.
Discovering, yeah. That's nice. And Amelia, for you?
Not surprising. I think I operate more like you do. I walk through and I'm making lists and taking note of things I like when it ends up being 50, 100 pieces. And then I go back to my hotel and I say, oh, where could these go? And then I come back and when it's not so crowded, and I make look for specific pieces then. But I think always when I travel or when I go to a fair, I'm constantly looking and cataloging things that I'm not sure where they'll end up. But I feel like because of what I do and knowing my clients, I'm drawn to certain things, and those things will end up in a project eventually. And so I'm kind of a little bit of both.
And speaking of traveling, we're so fortunate to have the winter show here on Park Avenue, but what fairs are you traveling to? What are the ones that pique your interest and are worth hopping on a plane for?
Well, I love TAFOF in Maastricht. I think it's one of the most extraordinary fairs. And I think there's an energy there that is unlike any other fair in the world. And there's such a huge range of whether it's oceanic, whether it's African, whether it's Chinese, whether it's European, whatever. I mean, I just find it fascinating. And that's a fair where it's really hard to go through with a shopping list in mind because you are so captivated by so many different things and so many things that have nothing to do with what I've been thinking about. And I love that, but you really need several days to take it in. But it's beautiful, and also Maastricht has some really great restaurants. No great hotels, but really good restaurants.
I was going to say, come on, admit it, you're just going for the food. No, I agree. I think TAFOF is extraordinary. I think the thing that TAFOF does for decorative arts like no other fair is bring expertise. And so whenever you find something, you can get second opinions in a very good way. I, of course, also like Basel in Basel, and that's mostly for the sausages available.
Well, I have to admit, I'm not designated, I don't go to designated fairs.
Mhm.
I tend to, because I actually owned an antique shop at one time, and I like to buy more than sell, so that works out well. But I like to go, if there's something, and I'm in that there, I'll go. But I also like going to auctions, I like going to markets, I like going, because of the antique dealer in me. I'm used to looking everywhere, and not just at fairs, but if I'm in London and the fair is going on, I'd certainly go. So I don't travel to go to fairs.
In other cities you like for antique shopping that you think are really strong?
Well, all the small cities, like in France, I love going to France and Italy, and I bought basically from England and France when this was in my 20s. I knew nothing about what I was doing, but I learned a lot, because I think now when you're looking at it on the internet, you don't learn what you do by walking and talking to these people who put their love into collecting, and their knowledge is there to share. They love talking about antiques. So I think it's a valuable history lesson when you walk through the aisles here.
How do you two feel about that? Do you think it's worth it to not look at your phone on these things and actually get up and see them?
Seeing is believing. And I mean, also, I'll never forget, back in my Parish Hadley days, one of the great English dealers came into the office one day and said, you know, we're beginning to think about developing a website. And we're all like, what's a website? You know, I mean, I'm talking 30 years ago. And we're all like, no, I don't care about a website. I'd rather get on a plane, go to London, you know, go around to all the dealers and the galleries anywhere. And it's the only way you learn furniture, or paintings, or sculpture, or anything. I mean, you know, you can't learn architecture by just opening up a book. You can see beautiful things, but you have to physically be in space. You have to physically be able to touch things. You know, otherwise, I don't know how you learn from a computer monitor, but that is, unfortunately, I find how many of the younger generation of designers are sort of coming up through the ranks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the advent of website and online shopping has introduced a terrible habit, because people buy things at auction from an auction in Paris, where things may be relatively less expensive than they are at Christie's in a New York sale. So then you get them, and they're like, oh, surprise. There's a leg missing. They said it's in relatively good condition. And you thought, because it was $75, that was well worth it. No, I think seeing things, understanding how they're made, what the proportion is, what the condition is, and what the presence of a particular piece is indispensable. And if you can't travel, stay in your own place, in your own town. There is so much you can find in New York City, and so much you can find at these fairs like this one, where you could make your visit to this fair a treasure hunt, really.
And then you have the benefit here, you can ask so many questions and really start that dialogue. Are there certain things that you ask?
Well,
If you're looking at people, like, what are the sort of, like, you should always...
Well, I think that it's very intimidating when you don't know furniture and you don't know, or any of these things that we're talking about, and you don't know dealers. And so depending upon the gallery, you know, you walk in and you get this kind of frozen stare, and you're like, oh God, I'm not going to ask a question. But the truth is, that's also how you learn. And
Right.
the dealers, when you engage them, they want to be engaged. They want to have people that are curious and excited, and I'd say, like all of us, we're kids in a candy store here. And, you know, everybody feeds on that kind of enthusiasm. So, you know, for me, when I go to a dealer, particularly if it's something I don't know a lot about, I'm going to ask them to explain what makes it different. You know, if it's a neoclassical piece of furniture, what are the details that separate it from a Louis XVI chair, let's say. That's what makes it so much fun for me always to go to the shows and the fairs and all of this. I mean, it really makes it wonderful.
So if you don't buy something, you learn something.
Absolutely, absolutely. it's all for the eye and the
Yeah.
mind. So
Do you have certain questions that you're asking when you walk around, or?
Well, I think that the challenging thing when you come to a fair is to not just look at the things that you are biased to see, but to push yourself to look at things that you might not ordinarily look at with a great deal of care, because it is then when you all of a sudden discover something that you didn't know before, and it allows you to make different kinds of connections. And like Ryan said, I think the conversations that you get to have with the dealers and the experts in that particular thing allows you to sort of opens the door to somebody else's passion. And I think that's incredibly rewarding.
yeah, I had a client, just as an example, I had a client years ago that had a fascination with angels, and when she said that angels were going to play a big part in her life, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? But she was a client that I could take to Europe, and so, we began to discover like Baroque and, some really beautiful examples. So she ended up getting some great things, but I was terrified in the beginning.
Next thing you know, you are a collector of angels.
I'm her angel.
Oh. And Amelia, like having had an antique shop, what were the questions you were asking? What are the questions that you like to ask?
When you have an antique shop, you're asking for, let's turn it over and look at all the
Yeah.
pieces and be sure that it's what you say it is. But I personally like to know provenance. I like to know whose hands were on these things, and I like the history behind how they came to be in this place where you can now buy it. And it's a special allure to me to about pieces.
And I'd love to ask each of you, so on the last page of gallery, we have this page called In Focus, and we ask someone about a work of art or an antique that they own and how they acquired it and why they love it and where they have it in their own home. So I'd love to hear from each of you what that piece is.
I can't say this is my favorite piece because I'd be lying, but we have a commode, it's a George II commode that had started out 30 some odd years ago with one client. They put it at auction, I sold it to another client. It then ended up in a son's bedroom, and I said, I'll buy it from you. And I did, and then Alan Rubin, who was a great European dealer who was in London and then moved to Paris, he came to our apartment one night years ago, and he walked in and he said, do you have any idea what that is? And I was like, I haven't a clue, except that it's a very architectural Georgian piece. And he said it's by Mayhew and Ince, and it was part of a suite that was in one of the rooms, one of the guest rooms in Blenheim.
Wow.
And I mean, I would never have known that if Rubin hadn't walked into our apartment. So that was a wonderful
You
moment.
might not necessarily have been able to purchase it in that case.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's the other thing, right? And I didn't dupe my client into selling it to me.
How about for you, Annabelle?
A long time ago, I bought, because I thought it was very chic, a pair of Chinese chairs. And I took them to I was living in a loft in Soho then, took them to my loft. And I think it was possibly the Winter Antique Show where I met a dealer of Chinese art and Chinese furniture, Nicholas Brindley. And we struck up a conversation, and he explained very generously so much about the beautiful new furniture that he had. And my office and my home were sort of connected across a little hallway. And so I invited him to come to the office because we were working on a project there. And I said, oh, I actually bought some Chinese furniture. And he looked at these chairs and he said, firewood. Firewood would be what this is.
Oh my gosh.
Some years later, I bought from him a very beautiful softwood chair, and that is one of my favorite pieces and is testimony to listening and learning.
It's amazing. Amelia, for you?
I think I have two minarets in my living room that are about 6 feet tall. They're made of ebony wood, and they're a copy of the Ottoman large structure in New Delhi. And I I saw these in the 70s when I came for a visit with a teacher, and we went to Billy Baldwin's home, and he took us to an apartment, and these were flanking a fireplace there, and I was totally struck with the whole room, because it was all blue and white, and the minarets were there. And so, 40 years later, 35 years.
I just had this room as one of my favorite rooms.
35 years later, I walked
Absolutely
into a
fabulous.
shop in Charleston, and there they are.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I have to have this. So now they're at my house, right
They're amazing.
on the side of the fireplace. They're great.
And is the room blue?
No, the room's not blue. But I think he'd be pleased.
Well, I don't want to be the only one to get to ask this amazing panel question, so I'd love to open it up to everyone here, and feel free to ask all sorts of difficult questions to this panel. They're ready. Yes.
I have one for Annabelle. I was looking at the in class when I was 19, and my youngest was born there. He wants to be an architect. It's a little self-serving, but do you have any words of wisdom or advice from you?
Travel, go see things, ask all the questions, learn about the history of architecture, look at old things, look at new things, be curious, but make it a point. It's like you can't appreciate a good piece of furniture unless you see it for real. It's that much more true for architecture. And when you're in the presence of great architecture, I think there is nothing better. So architecture happens to be the mother of all arts. No, I think that it is really the thing that is inspiring and moving, and he'll find out whether that is really what he wants to do. Because once he's hooked on architecture, it's a lot of work. Get ready.
That's great advice. Yes, Blair.
My question is simple. It's for Brian. Something you said in the very beginning. I think we all have a lot of friends that are decorators and designers, and I'm slightly offended sometimes by saying the wrong term, and you called yourself a decorator in the very beginning. And I have said to our friends, I'm a decorator, I'm a designer. Can you tell me the difference?
I think it was a move away from my father. When my father was a naval architect and very academic and very extremely well educated and very cultured. And the idea that I was going to art school when I went to Pratt, and then chose the interior design department as my school. He would always say, "My son is in interior design school, not decorating school." So it was that reference that then later led me to say, and then of course I went to Parish Hadley, and I really viewed Parish Hadley as decorators, even though we had an architecture department. So that's the reason why. And I don't really see it differently in terms of my role, whether it be a decorator or designer.
Amelia?
Well, I think it's a long time ago when Parish Hadley, that was so long ago, and Billy Baldwin, they called themselves decorators. And I've never felt strongly that I should be an interior designer or a decorator, because some of our projects fall more into decorating than design. I mean, I think you do both, but I'm not insulted by the decorator.
Does that help you for when they say that next time?
Yes.
Okay.
Susie said it's better than cutting a root.
No, it's true.
More questions? Anyone else with a question? Okay. Oh, yes.
I have one. Would you say that, I got a lot of this. Would you say that you all knew, I'd be interested to hear from each of you about when you determined what you wanted to do, like when you found your calling, when you knew that you wanted to do design, when you knew that you wanted to be an architect? Was it something that you felt inherently from a very young age, or was it something that kind of, as you were kind of growing
wants to start that?
Well, I graduated with a degree in art history first before I went to design school. And before that, I was in fine art, and I knew that I couldn't really paint. And so then I couldn't paint. And I moved on to what would be a creative venue for me that I could do. And I still, when I walk in rooms, I like them best empty. I love empty rooms. And then the palette starts to come together. And unlike a lot of people, I'll start with color and then go from adding pieces and layering into that. Does that answer the question? I think I knew that I wanted to be a designer once I knew I could be a painter.
I mean, for me, I sort of fell into it at school. As a teenager, all I wanted to do was be on the back of a horse and dreamt of being on the U.S. show jumping team and doing all of that. But that was not my reality.
Yeah.
And I did a gap year, and in that gap year, I did horses 24/7, and I realized that it was such a narrow-minded profession that I couldn't possibly survive a lifetime of that. I mean, I continued doing it as an amateur. But so I went to school. I mean, my only strength in school was art. So I put a portfolio together and applied to several schools and went to Pratt and fell in love with it and met people in the interior design department and, thinking I was going for industrial design. But I found the interior design department so much more fulfilling, the idea of what I could be doing. And I've also always had a love for houses, but I couldn't have put a finger on that. So, I really got lucky is what I got. I'm very fortunate and very grateful.
My father, who was an architect, and who always worked with my mother, who wasn't a trained designer, but sort of worked together with him on interiors. My father said when I proposed at the behest of my best friend that we would move to Munich to study interior design, my father said, go study architecture because when you're an architect you can do interior design, but you can't do it the other way around. And long story short, I went to Pratt, studied architecture, and then did some interior design. So
6 degrees.
Exactly.
I think that's a lovely way to end with the beginnings of your careers, which are all amazing. Thank you so much for being a wonderful panel, and thank you for being